The Bristol Bulldog was a single-seat fighter that was developed for the Royal Air Force in the mid to late 1920s, and it's one of my favourite aircraft from this era. It was also one of the best aircraft of its era, not because it covered itself in glory or because it set numerous aerial records, because it didn't, but because it was simply good, consistently good, at what it did. The Bulldog was a stout, no-nonsense machine, something that quite suited its namesake. Almost 450 of these fighter aircraft were produced, and they served the RAF as its primary defence fighter until the late 1930s. The Bulldog would earn an excellent reputation for reliability and ease of handling. It was almost completely viceless, and it became especially popular with nighttime fighter squadrons, who valued ease of use above all else. Now, when the Bulldog first entered service back in 1929, it was a very welcome addition to the RAF, as in recent years the development of fighter aircraft could be best summed up as depressingly mediocre. This was for two main reasons. Firstly, the British economy in the early 1920s had the strength of a tranquilized mouse, courtesy of the First World War, which severely limited the funds available to develop a new aircraft. Secondly, Britain had been lulled into a false sense of security by the state of the French bombing fleet, with the slow Farman Goliath being their main heavy bomber. In the immediate post-war years, France was the only potential enemy Britain could expect in a future European war, though this was of course very unlikely, and because of this, their bomber fleet was the only one Britain was building to counter. The Germans had no air force at all, the Soviets were too far away and in too much turmoil to be considered a credible threat, and the Italians were still building themselves up in terms of air power. Thus, the Air Ministry, seeing the sedate pace of French bomber development, whose interesting trajectory we've already covered on this channel, decided to focus on versatility and serviceability when outlining the requirements for their new fighter aircraft. This, of course, came at the expense of speed and firepower, and it's why most British fighters of the early to mid-1920s had very modest performance. The only outlier being the Armstrong-Whitworth Siskin, though even then maximum speed had not been a priority when designing it. It wasn't until mid to late 1924 that the Air Ministry began to consider the idea of a new generation of interceptor aircraft that had a higher focus on performance. This resulted in specification F-17/24, which called for a fighter aircraft to replace the Armstrong-Whitworth Siskin, which, by the way, we have already covered on this channel as well. It was meant to be powered by a Rolls-Royce Falcon 10, and Bristol Aircraft was one of the companies invited to tender a submission. However, Bristol aircraft engineer Frank Barnwell and its engine designer, Roy Fedden, disagreed on the engine choice, as Fedden wanted to use an engine that was being developed by his own team and not one by Rolls-Royce. The project got nowhere because of this, and it was eventually shelved as Bristol focused instead on other aircraft, like the Bristol Bagshot, which itself didn't really go anywhere and was eventually viewed by Barnwell as a waste of time and resources. But on the side, Barnwell kept working on the single-seat fighter concept, and eventually he submitted it towards specification F-1926, which called for a day and nighttime fighter, as well as specification N1/26, which called for a shipborne variant of the same design. In fact, two separate designs would eventually evolve from this work. There was the Bristol Type 105, which was designed to the original 1924 specification, but updated to meet the later ones, and then there was the Type 107, which was loosely based on this design itself, but was modified once again to a new specification, which was F-20/27. This called for a high-speed interceptor which could rapidly overtake an enemy bomber flying at 150 miles an hour at 20,000 feet. Both designs showed promise, and while the Air Ministry only ordered a prototype of the Type 107, the Type 105 was built by Bristol as a private venture, and the company gave them the names of Bullpup and Bulldog respectively. Initially, both aircraft shared a similar layout. They were single-seat, single-bay biplanes with equal-span wings. They had steel tube construction, and they were to be powered by the new Bristol Mercury 9-cylinder radial engine. The Bulldog was originally meant to have an earlier version of the Mercury, whereas the Bullpup was designed around the new geared Mercury 3. Both designs, however, would soon change. The lower wing on both was reduced in both span and chord, with the aircraft becoming a sesquiplane, and due to a predicted shortage in Mercury engines, owing to development delays, it was decided to equip the Bulldog with a different power plant altogether. This was done as, initially, the Bulldog was the less promising of the two designs, being a private venture, and thus less likely to receive any production orders from the Air Ministry. And the Bulldog was modified to accept the Bristol Jupiter engine, which was an older 9-cylinder radial from which the Mercury itself was being developed. This actually turned out to be a very wise decision on the part of Bristol, as the Bulldog would be completed and flown well before the Bullpup. This was not just because the Bullpup was held up by numerous engine delays, but also because the Bulldog was itself a private venture, and because of that, its development was not being hampered by the often tediously slow decision-making process of the Air Ministry, who would often request changes at various stages of the design and development process, sometimes at the last minute and often to the distress of aircraft engineers across the nation. Powered by a Bristol Jupiter 7, which produced approximately 375 horsepower or thereabouts, the Bulldog made its first flight on the 17th of May 1927. As completed, it was built with a tubular steel frame, based on methods developed by Bolt and Paul, and the whole airframe, with the exception of the front fuselage, was clad in doped fabric. Fuel was stored in 2 gravity tanks located in the upper wing, outboard of the center section. The lubricating oil tank was placed behind the fireproof engine bulkhead and included a surface air cooler, and the interplane struts were made of steel tubes, covered with balsa wood for streamlining, while the center section cabane was supported by steel tube strutting. 2 Vickers guns were the main armament, and they were mounted low on each side of the cockpit, firing through the propeller arc using an interrupter gear. A shortwave two-way radio would be installed in a small compartment just behind the cockpit, and the undercarriage had a relatively long-stroke design, allowing the airplane to operate from very rough airfields, using oleodamped rubber compression spring legs. Now, in general, this construction was nothing groundbreaking, and indeed it was conventional in almost every way. Barnwell had opted for this as he believed he had to choose between either a powerful engine or a more advanced airframe, as doing both would introduce far too much risk. His caution soon paid dividends. Piloted by Cyril Ewins, who was Bristol's chief test pilot, the Bulldog performed so well in its early test flights that it was immediately ordered to go to Martlesham Heath for formal evaluations by the Air Ministry for service testing with the RAF. During these evaluations, it was competed against other aircraft that were being built for the day-night fighter specification of 1926. In contrast, the Bristol Bullpup would not compete in its own trials for another 2 years, and even then it was still not powered by the Bristol Mercury, as its development had encountered numerous delays. Instead, it was powered by a Bristol Jupiter F, and its performance was alright, but it did not live up to expectations, and only this one example of the Bristol Bullpup would ever be built. Now, in contrast to this, the Bulldog had a much better time of it. In the summer of 1927, it competed against a collection of fighter aircraft, which each had some of the most stereotypically quaint British names you could think of. There was the Armstrong-Whitworth Starling, the Boulton-Paul Partridge, the Gloucester Goldfinch, and the Hawker Hawfinch. Bristol was the underdog, literally, as they were the only company not to go with an avian name. Eventually, the competition was narrowed to a choice between the Bristol and the Hawker designs, and at the end of the evaluation, the Bulldog emerged as the apparent victor. Its well-harmonized controls gave it exceptional maneuverability. Its fabric coverings never suffered from distortion during high-speed and high-G maneuvers, a point of concern for many designers of this period, and in a high-speed dive, it remained fully controllable at 270 miles per hour, which was a blistering pace for the mid to late 1920s. Despite the Bulldog's excellent performance, the Air Ministry delayed its final decision so that both manufacturers could make further improvements. With the Bulldog, it was felt that its spin recovery could be better, and the aircraft was modified with a larger rudder in the autumn of 1927. Unfortunately, this had a profoundly negative impact on handling when trying to land in a crosswind, and Bristol, wishing to preserve their best test pilot, opted for a different solution instead. The fuselage would be lengthened, which would increase the effectiveness of the original rudder by giving it greater leverage around the aircraft's center of mass. Modifying the existing Bulldog would have been far too costly, and so instead the Air Ministry ordered a second prototype to be built as the Bristol Bulldog Mark II. It was first flown on January the 21st, 1928, after which it went to Martlesham Heath for a new evaluation against the modified Hawker Hawfinch. The competition was exceptionally close, and in the end the Bulldog did not win because of performance, but instead on the point of ease of maintenance. Being a single-bay biplane with wing-mounted tanks, it was able to be serviced and repaired almost twice as quickly as the Hawker. This was not only important from the point of field maintenance, but also from the point of financial cost. And this, above all else, was the reason why the Bulldog received its first production order. 25 Bulldogs would initially be ordered for the RAF, plus the production of an additional aircraft to serve as a demonstrator. As the Bulldog had been designed and built as a private venture, Bristol had not been limited when it came to seeking out export customers, and this demonstrator would be used to help curry interest from international parties. The first production Bulldogs would be delivered to the RAF in May of 1929, with 18 aircraft joining No. 3 Squadron and the rest going to No. 17 Squadron. These were night fighter squadrons, which had been operating the Hawker Woodcock, and the Bristol Bulldog soon became popular as it was very easy to handle, which made nighttime operations a little less strenuous on the pilots. The Bulldog had barely been in service for a few months before reports of its excellent performance soon attracted foreign interest. In September of 1929, 5 Bulldogs were ordered by the Latvian Air Force. The only major changes were the engine, which was to be a French-built version of the Bristol Jupiter, and the guns, which would be Swedish-built Oerlikons. Following this, the Air Ministry ordered a further batch of 40 Bulldogs the following month, of which a significant number would actually end up going to foreign buyers. 2 went to the Royal Siamese Air Force, 8 to the Royal Australian Air Force, who also used one of theirs as a testbed for the Bristol Mercury 3, and 3 went to the Swedish Air Force. One of the other Bulldogs was sent to the United States, sadly as a replacement for an earlier Bulldog, which had been sent to the US Navy for evaluation, but which had crashed in a terminal dive, killing Lieutenant George Cudahy, who was a promising pilot for the Schneider Trophy races. The remaining 23 Bulldogs from this order would join the RAF, entering in with numbers 17 and 54 squadrons. But not long after this, a further 20 aircraft were once again ordered for export. 7 went to Latvia, joining the 5 already there. One was delivered as a new demonstrator, as the old one was wearing out, and the remaining 12 were sold to Estonia. Details of the Bulldog's early service history in Britain and overseas is unfortunately very sparse, but from what little record there is, it is known that the type received universal praise. Not only was it a pilot's dream in terms of handling, which made it very forgiving for novice airmen, it was also very easy to maintain and service. The stove-enamelled steel structure resisted corrosion, which was particularly good in the cold, wet climates of Latvia, and features like quickly detachable fuel tanks and grouped lubrication points made daily servicing a breeze. Now, Bristol were very quick to capitalise on this success, and long before the final batch of 20 Bulldog Mark IIs were delivered, work had begun on the improved Mark IIA. This model featured the Jupiter 7F, which had forged cylinder heads. It had revised ailerons and wing spars, and it had several minor modifications to the cockpit to improve pilot comfort. This resulted in a large order for 92 aircraft by the RAF, with the Bulldogs going to 32, 54, and 111 squadrons, as well as an order for 8 Bulldogs for the Swedish Air Force. Another 4 were then ordered by Denmark, but these differed as they had the Jupiter 6FH, which was an unblown high-compression version of the engine, and in place of the Vickers guns, they installed Mazden guns. While production of these Bulldogs was still underway, the Air Ministry followed up their order with another order for 100 aircraft. Of these, 15 went to No. 19 Squadron, 12 went to No. 41 Squadron, and the rest would be placed in reserve as depot units and spares. This was significant, as it indicated that the RAF was intending to operate the Bulldog for some time, which was a strong mark of confidence in the Bulldog's capabilities, seeing as it had barely been in service for more than 18 months. A little later, in the early 1930s, 2 more production orders would be placed. One for 38 production models of the Mark IIA to add to the existing stock, and the other was for 17 two-seat training versions. These were based on a training prototype which had been modified from an existing Mark II service aircraft. They had a slightly increased rudder area, and they had swept-back wings to compensate for the shift in the center of gravity by the addition of a second pilot seat. These training aircraft performed very well, and this led to a follow-up order for 48 aircraft in 1933, though sources do conflict on the year of this order, some say 1932 instead. Now, during this time period, from 1930 to 1932-1933, all existing RAF Bulldogs were modified to an improved specification. Following successful tests, the Bulldog was fitted with Dunlop disc wheels and Bendix brakes. A tail wheel would replace the old-school tail skid, and the area of the tail fin was slightly increased to improve directional stability. It was in this new form, but still with the same designation of Mark IIA, that the Bulldog would form the bulk of Britain's defensive fighter force in the early 1930s. Of the 13 frontline fighter squadrons in service for air defense, 10 of them would operate the Bristol Bulldog as their standard equipment. Though they would see no action during their time with the RAF, the Bulldog became one of the most popular aircraft of the interwar period. This was not only because they handled well and were easy to service, but they were also excellent crowd pleasers. Like the Armstrong-Whitworth Siskin, they made routine appearances at various airshows across the country, particularly the annual display at Hendon, and their performances often received glowing reviews in various publications, particularly Flight magazine. But these aerobatic displays didn't always go to plan, and it's here that we come to an interesting historical anecdote about the Bulldog. In 1931, pilot officer Douglas Bader was a little bit naughty and took his Bulldog Mark II up for an unauthorized display, flying above Woodley Airfield near Reading. Now, this was apparently done as part of a dare, and conducted at low altitude and at moderately high speeds. Now, during a very low pass of this unauthorized display, one of Bader's wingtips clipped the ground, and the laws of physics did the rest. He crashed, badly, and after being rushed to hospital, both of his legs had to be amputated, one above the knee and one below the knee. Now, the full details of this story is one for another day, but in a nutshell, this did not deter Bader from flying again. After a long convalescence and the acquisition of prosthetic legs, he eventually returned to the skies. And as storm clouds began to gather over Europe, he even managed to re-enlist and fly with the RAF. With the dogged stubbornness of a bulldog, he proved that the crash in his bulldog had not deprived Bader of his flying skills. And this would be correct. During the Second World War, this double amputee would become a prominent flying ace, credited with 22 aerial victories, 4 shared victories, and 6 probables. He would then be forced to bail out over German-occupied France, where he briefly befriended German ace Adolf Galland, after which he would make numerous escape attempts from various POW prisons before being sent to the famous prisoner of war camp at Colditz Castle, where he remained until its liberation in 1945. Now, putting aside that very inspiring story for the time being, as that is one I want to cover in detail in the future, we will return to the Bulldog itself. Though it saw no action in British hands, overseas the Bulldog would see action with one air service. The final production order for the Bristol Bulldog was for 17 Bulldog Mark IVAs, which was placed for the Finnish Air Force. The Mark IVA was a development of the experimental Mark IIIA, which was developed to test the Bristol Mercury engine, which was finally becoming available in the mid-1930s. Equipped with the Bristol Mercury Mark IV, only 2 Bulldog Mark IIIs would be built. They had a redesigned upper wing, which allowed fuel to be stored internally, a redesigned lower wing, which had a reduced chord to improve pilot visibility. The rear fuselage was reinforced to cope with higher airspeeds, and the new engine was fitted with a town-end ring to reduce frontal drag. Developed as a private venture, the Mark III Bulldog was first flown in 1932 in a competition against a new fighter being developed by Gloucester, the Gauntlet. The Gauntlet proved to be superior, but the Bulldog's performance had improved enough for a second Mark III to be built and displayed at the 1932 Paris Air Show. From this, the company received interest from the Finns, which led to the Mark IVA. With the significantly more powerful Mercury engine, the Mark IVA boasted a top speed of 224 miles an hour in level flight. Along with the aforementioned changes, they also featured a comprehensive electrical system, which included a landing lamp for night operations, and electrical heating for the cockpit and the guns, as Finland is, after all, somewhat frosty. Happily, these improvements did not come at the cost of handling, and the Finnish Bulldogs handled just as well as their Jupiter-powered predecessors. This would be put to the test 4 years later after their 1935 delivery, when, in 1939, the Winter War would erupt between Finland and the Soviet Union. During the bitter defense of Karelia, 10 Finnish Bulldogs went against Soviet aircraft, and indeed, it was a Bulldog that gained them their first aerial victory when it shot down a Polikarpov I-16 in December of 1939. Despite facing opponents who were often technologically superior, some of these Bulldogs fought on during the Continuation War, with one surviving all the way up to 1944, after which it was retired and placed in storage. Today, it can still be found on display at the Hallin Portti Aviation Museum. Now, this Finnish aircraft is not the only surviving Bulldog. A British example still exists today, as does an airworthy replica. Now, this is a pleasant surprise, as many interwar aircraft were never kept for preservation and were instead simply broken up for scrap. Indeed, for the Bulldog, this is especially fortunate, as the type saw very active service with the RAF all the way up to 1937, And despite almost 450 being built, it's something of a miracle that even these few survived. Though they saw no action, they were used continuously, which brought about its fair share of attritional losses from accidents, airframe wear and tear, etc. And a number were also deployed to the Sudan during the Abyssinia crisis of 1935 to 1936, and the hot climate down there did not do them any favours. When the Bulldog was retired from frontline use in 1937, it was replaced by the Gloucester Gauntlet, which itself would be superseded by the venerable Gloucester Gladiator. However, by this time, the era of the biplane had pretty much drawn to its end, with the arrival of such aircraft as the monoplane Hawker Hurricane and the Messerschmitt Bf-109. The Bulldog, then, was one of the last biplane fighters of its time that would spend most of its service life in a state of relevance rather than obsolescence. And for that, I think it's quite special. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. Now, it's been a very long time since I've uploaded a proper video, so thank you all so much for your patience during this chaotic time. And I apologize if the audio is a bit different, as I'm currently having to record in a room with terrible acoustic properties, and I'm probably going to have to do so much editing and post it's not even funny. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander patrons, our highest tier members. Now, I believe the patron list is up to date here, but if I've missed anyone's name, please send me a message on Patreon and I'll update it for the next time. For now, there is no real fixed video schedule, as I'm currently hunting for an apartment in the city right now, but hopefully that should be sorted out soon, and my office can eventually be fully reassembled. But for now, thank you all so much for watching and for your continued support. It means the absolute world to me, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.